Hello, my name is Marissa Hattab, and I'm the Training and Partnership Development Manager for Mentor Nebraska. Today, we welcome you to our first pre-recorded webinar on screening applicants for effectiveness. We'd also like to give a special shout out to today's training sponsor, QTAC Rock. So let's dive into today's training. I want to share a little bit about who Mentor Nebraska is and what our mission is, just in case you don't know much about who we are. So Mentor Nebraska is passionate about fueling the quality and the quantity of mentoring relationships, strengthening collaboration, and advocating for mentoring. That includes mentors, that includes mentees, and just ensuring that our sector gets provided the resources, opportunities, and the ability to network and share what their desires are, what their needs are, and also some of their successes and things that need to be strengthened. And we love to be the convening and the program that brings everyone together as well. So today's learning objectives, what we hope you walk away with today. We hope that you are able to become more aware of the prevalence of child predators and tactics they employ in targeting victims and community youth serving organizations. We desire to discuss the latest research on perpetrators as well as potential red flags and warning signs to be aware of during your application and monitoring processes. And 3, we hope to learn about and practice screening tools and guidelines that youth professionals such as yourself can apply in order to maximize the safety of the children and youth you serve. So let's dive in. What we are going to learn about a man named Edwin. Bear with me, we're going to take some time to kind of read his profile. And as you're listening, I just hope that you're able to kind of think about Edwin. If he were to come to your program, is he someone that you would like to be a mentor? Would you accept him? Would you decline him? Would you want to do further investigation? Just think about some of those things as I'm reading who Edwin is. So, Edwin contacted your agency after finding the volunteer opportunity listing on the internet. Shanika conducted the orientation he attended. She had little interaction with Edwin, but her observations that he was very attentive and enthusiastic. During her orientation report to her coworkers, she stated that Edwin asked several questions regarding the needs of the mentees, the family's issues of a typical mentee, and whether most mentees and mentors meet for at least the program's initial 1-year period. Shanika was also scheduled to conduct Edwin's interview. Edwin's responses in the interview were brief but complete, and Shanika was hopeful that his experience as a parent might fit well for the children in their program. On the night of the interview, Shanika arrived at the house expecting to meet Edwin's family. He explained that his wife and 2 boys might be back by the end of the interview, but that the family rarely spent much time together until the evenings because of their busy schedules. During the interview, Shanika learned that Edwin had grown up in the area and had had a difficult childhood. His father left when he was just a baby, and his mother struggled to provide for him. Her boyfriend moved into their apartment when he was in elementary school, but the boyfriend was physically abusive towards Edwin's mother, a topic Edwin apparently found difficult to share with Shanika. Edwin said he focused on schools and sports, eventually finishing high school and joining the Army for 4 years. He then returned to the area, attended college, and started a small business. His company and investments did particularly well, and he began looking for ways to give back to the community. He volunteered through several youth organizations, and during one project, he met his wife, Linda. She had 2 boys involved with the youth program, and Edwin met her when she came to pick them up at the end of a camping trip he had chaperoned. Linda had been a single parent for many years. She and her boys, then they were 8 and 9, were struggling financially, forcing Linda to work several jobs. Edwin had told Linda to call if she ever needed to help bring the boys home after program activities, and Linda did call, and Edwin explained that he fell in love with her and the whole family. He said that the boys are now involved in high school activities, so he does not see them much, but he's excited they are both doing well and planning to head off to college in the near future. As the interview wrapped up, Linda and her boys returned home. The boys were very polite, saying hello, ma'am, to Shanika, then headed to another part of the house. Linda offered a similar brief greeting before leaving the room. Edwin's references were all prominent business owners and community members, so they were difficult to contact and had little time to complete the reference check. All four had known him for a number of years, but none had spent time with him and his family socially. Two of the references commented on what a great mentor he would be, caring so much for the welfare of children. Edwin was so wonderful to Linda and boys, is one of the things that they said. He saved them from poverty and provided them with a big, beautiful home and private schools. Shanika had to ask Edwin for Glenda's contact information as he hadn't included her as a reference. This was the first time Shanika noticed that an applicant didn't list a spouse and said to Edwin that it was typical practice for applicants who are married or in a relationship just to make sure that they're comfortable with their partner's involvement in the program. Linda did not have much to say, and Shanika found her to be painfully timid. She answered all the questions, but her responses were not particularly enlightening and sounded somewhat rehearsed. After the volunteer training, led by another program coordinator, Shanika learned that Edwin had been an average participant. Her coworker, who paired herself with Edwin during the one-on-one discussion activities, found him to be odd, but enthusiastic and a prospect of becoming a mentor. Now, I know that was pretty long, right? But I wanted you to be able to get a clear perspective on who Edwin was and if you thought he would be, like I said, a good part of your mentoring program. I want you to begin thinking, were there things that stood out to you that made you think, oh, I think Edwin would be a great fit for our program? Were there some things that kind of your gut told you, maybe that's something to maybe further investigate? And I'm just curious, how do you typically respond if you have any feelings? So anyways, as we progress throughout today's training, we'll dive into some of those things a little bit more in depth. And at the end of today's training, we'll come back to Edwin and we'll see if your responses and the things that you're thinking about now will stay the same or maybe they'll change. So part one of today's training, purpose of screening volunteers and relevance to mentoring programs. Did you know? A percentage of predators will target child service groups because they provide access to samples of highly vulnerable children. Often there are different opportunities for isolated access. Many of these children have already been molested, making them more vulnerable to predators. Now, this quote right here was by Dr. Perry Serrata. And basically, this quote is kind of showcasing and giving us an idea as far as how our programs can sometimes be a program that predators are liable to attend, because in mentoring, specifically mentoring one-on-one scenarios or relationships, they're able to have alone time with youth. And so a lot of times when we're talking about predators or those who will have the ability to harm our children, they are looking for opportunities very similar to mentoring relationships where they have access and they have alone time. And so these are just some of the things that we need to be mindful of when we're coming up with our screening practices and our processes so that we can ensure that our youth are always safe. And so let's move on to the next slide. For some of us, even hearing the word predator and molestation and so on and so forth can be quite uncomfortable. And so I want to say to you, if any time during this training you're feeling uncomfortable or it's bringing up any icky feelings to yourself, please practice self-care and pause or step away. But why do we have to talk about this, right? Why? Because it is our duty, truthfully, and our responsibility to ensure that our youth are safe. And so sometimes having difficult conversations is essential, and we've got to have them. And when we're talking about who is being recruited and who is being drawn into our organizations, we have to be mindful that sometimes it's not always with the best intent. So research conducted by the Centers for Disease Control estimates that approximately 1 in 6 boys and 1 in 4 girls are sexually abused before the age of 18. Did this shock any of you? This is Marissa speaking. But just from experience and having conversations with adults and research and so on and so Oprah's show, that's just one example. I have learned that sometimes men, not boys, but men have a hard time even articulating and expressing that they've been sexually abused as boys, because sometimes our society have stigmas associated with boys and their sexuality and so on and so forth that keeps them quiet. So most victims struggle with shame because there's a process called grooming that we'll dive into later. But it's even more for boys. So I would say, and this is just Marissa speaking, that it's probably even higher in boys. Did this shock any of you? Maybe not. And so it's more prevalent than what we may even realize. So the national survey also showed that 12% of mentoring programs don't even screen volunteers at all. Is that shocking? It might not be. One of the things that I've learned is a lot of times mentoring programs are grassroots organizations or only have 1 or 2 staff, and they're having to maintain all aspects of their program. And come on, no shocker here, a lot of times mentors are not in abundance, right? Typically, we're trying to get more. We're doing recruitment events. And so sometimes our screening isn't very strong because we're just happy someone showed up. And that's where it can be problematic, y'all. Majority do interviews, fewer check references. So you may ask for references, but are you calling? And even fewer engage in full background checks. And research also shows that 50% using background checks look in only one state, the states that they reside in, right? And they don't look at any other national databases. And then 50% report screening has identified inappropriate candidates. So if you think about that, when you look at especially the last, all of them actually, but more importantly, the last 2, a lot of times predators will go from state to state to state to state. So if you're only getting a screenshot, in my opinion, of just where they're living, sometimes we're not able to get a holistic perspective on who is showing up to our mentoring programs. Another thing that I mentioned about why Mentor Nebraska exists in our mission is collaboration. That's one of the things that was mentioned. And sometimes just by having conversations with other mentoring programs, you'll learn, man, this candidate has jumped from mentoring program to mentoring program. And so having different practices and processes in place can also help ensure that we're keeping our youth safe as well. So I want us to look at this case study really quickly. Kenneth Lanning, an FBI behavior analyst, says that those leading double lives, especially sex offenders, can become quite adept at compartmentalizing their behavior. The person may look normal, have a job, work hard, go to church, but the indicators are things the average person is not trained to recognize. I want you to think, is there anyone that you've heard of, like growing up? It could have been like a soccer coach, a swimming coach, someone involved in a church, a family friend. A lot of times sexual predators are also not strangers. They're people that have built and maintained trust, not just with the youth, but their parents. And that's why mentoring can be the perfect recipe for our youth to be harmed, right? So I want you to think, has there ever been a time where the truth came out about someone and you had a hard time believing it was true about them? I'll give you an example. Growing up, my mother had a friend that they went to high school with. And he was very well known in our community. I'm from a small town in Ohio, and he oftentimes refereed Pee Wee basketball leagues all the way up through high school. He was just very involved. And he was comical, charming, witty. My mom would always laugh with him. They were not best friends, but they knew each other since childhood. But I knew as a teenage girl that when my mother and adults weren't around, he made teenage girls feel kind of icky. Just weird. Like he never tried anything towards me because he knew my mother. But one of my friends said that he had tried to do something with her. Mind you, we were 17. It was no surprise to me, but when I shared it with my mother, because later he got arrested for some things, my mom was somewhat surprised. But then I started sharing with her what I just shared with you, and she was like, there were some things that she could, empathize with and see that could cause harm. And perhaps he did do it. But he had worked really hard to be this normal, caring, witty, charismatic person that was involved with so many different things in the community. So the thing is, a lot of us, if we haven't gone through significant training or taken time to really learn about predators, truly, and I know the word predator seems like we're in the jungle, right? But it's true. Like we don't have the privilege to just be the average person. If we're working in mentoring programs, we have a responsibility to protect our youth. So how relevant is this issue in your community? And some of you may be in Omaha, some of you may be throughout other communities and throughout the state. And so I want you to kind of think, how prevalent is this in your community? Is there anything recently that has happened? And it's as simple as like taking out your phones and looking up child predators in your town and seeing what pops up. And I can assure you, there's probably some things that are going to pop up. And a lot of times it's happening in high schools and elementary schools and on teens. And so it's important for us to really be aware of what's going on so many different levels. We have a responsibility. Parents are entrusting us with their kids, and the kids are entrusting us as well. So let's learn about this man. Isn't his smile just so lovely? This is just one of the quotes that was said about him. Every Friday night, 10 to 12 youngsters show up at his house to watch movies. Finney even takes some of them out to the theaters about once a week. So kind. He's a youth ministry. His youth ministry proves rewarding for Finney. So anyways, that's where the quote came from. And this happened this quote came in 1989, which is actually when I was born, so 32 years ago. But let's learn a little bit more about him. How about that? As a camp counselor, Finney has become quite notorious. He tells his campers that he'll answer any questions they throw at him. In 5 years, Finney says he answered everyone. The youth director has handled every kind of topic: God, heaven, hell, sex, you name it. Matthew means gift of God, and Matty Finney certainly is a gift to his children. He obviously cares deeply for him and spends his free time with them and for them. He has added a possible 3 semesters onto his college education in order to perform his duties as a director of youth ministry for St. Joseph Parish. These are all different quotes about him, by the way. Another one says, the director of youth ministry job is more than a full-time position. Finney puts in many more hours with his kids than he's actually paid for. They stop by his house after school for some of the candy he conveniently keeps in his fish tank filled with. He eats lunch with the 4th and 5th graders every day at 11:30. Many of them don't even have a male role model, he said. As a talent agent, now this is giving you more a different perspective on who he is. Now it's not direct quotes. As a talent agent, Finney often had children at his Cottage Grove home to watch movies, play Xbox, and spend the night. He was also known to organize outings like camping trips and days at Valley Fair, as well as trips to film festivals. Finney often communicated with the boys through text messages and frequently asked the then 14-year-old brother to come to his home to watch movies, play video games, or perform work for money. He also asked parents if they could stay the night on a regular basis. In 1992, Finney was convicted of fourth-degree criminal sexual conduct while he was a counselor at a Catholic youth camp in Aiken County. In February of this year, he was charged with indecent assault and battery, enticing a child in unnatural acts in Massachusetts after he was accused of assaulting a 14-year-old boy in his home. However, he posted bail in the case. So, did any of this stand out to you? Does any of this stand out to you? Any red flags going on that kind of led to that last paragraph? So I don't know if you noticed, but in 1992 is when that sexual conduct things happened at the Catholic school and all of that. I want us to fast forward. He posted bail in that case. He never went to jail permanently. We're going to fast forward. Minnesota talent agent Matthew Finney jailed on child molestation charge June 25th of when? Boom, boom, boom. 2012. 20 years later. So this is what it read, y'all. Matthew David Finney, 43, turned himself at the Washington County Jail at 5:45 a.m. Tuesday to be held on a $200,000 bail. He is scheduled to appear in court at 10:30 on 2 felony charges of criminal sexual conduct, one for engaging in sexual contact with a 9-year-old boy, and a second for abusing a 15-year-old boy while in a position of authority. The criminal complaint states that Finney met the brothers through Walden Entertainment in Bloomington, where he is the owner and casting director who works to secure acting roles in movies and television. So there was a lot, right? So what he started as a minister is not how he finished, right? In 2012, he was a film director. And both of those were positions where he had access by himself. He also had youth that like trusted him in a church. That's oftentimes where youth feel the safest. And then think about it, in film ministry, that's attached to youth's dreams, their hopes. They want to be famous, they want to be known. And he utilized both of those to cause harm, and primarily to boys, right? You didn't hear girls, it was boys. And when we think about even further back when we were discussing 1 out of 6 boys and 1 in 4 girls say that they've been sexually abused before the time they're 18, some people wouldn't even have thought he would be harming the boys, right? So if we look at this triangle concerning perpetrators, this kind of showcases how many of them are actually held responsible for the harm that they do. So if we look all the way at the bottom, it says most cases are never accused or even identified. The second ladder says they're accused or identified. So that means someone makes a complaint. Then out of those, smaller numbers are even investigated. Then after some are investigated, even fewer are arrested. And then after they've been arrested, because think about it, in 1992, Finney was arrested, but he was not convicted, right? So fewer were even convicted. And then even after they're convicted, some of them don't even go in the system. Sometimes they get probation. Sometimes they go into the system for a short amount of time. I mentioned that I'm from a small town in Ohio, and there's a place called Dayton, Ohio. And years ago, I don't remember the boy's name. Well, no, not boy. He was a man. He was in college, but he was found raping this girl outside of a party by dumpsters. And he was caught in the act. 2 men saw him doing it. They pulled him off. They reported him. They called the police. He was arrested. He was identified. He was arrested. He was even convicted. But because of the power that his family had, they were very wealthy. He only served 3 months in prison and had to list himself as a offender. But he was caught in the act and not in the system. So that just gives you perspective. So safety net. Here are just some statistics when it comes to the background checks that have been processed in some of our mentoring programs. And this research is showed through the National Mentoring Resource Center. And MRC is another form of it. 6.1% had criminal records of concern. So out of the 50,000 background checks that were processed, only 6.1% of them had any level of criminal record. Oh, sorry. Even though applicants knew background check would be performed, over 50% of those with criminal records indicated that they did not have one. So when they were being interviewed, they were not forthcoming about having the criminal record, right? 40% with the criminal records committed crimes in states other than where they were applying to volunteer. So remember, when we looked at statistics before, we saw that most of the mentoring programs, if they even had screening practices in place, only looked at one state. When we look at the statistics here, 40% of that 6.1% had records elsewhere, not in the same state they were saying. So if you only had that practice in place, you wouldn't even know that they had a record, right? Nearly 23% of these individuals provided a different name or date of birth on their application than what appeared on the criminal record. A name-based search would likely not have caught these criminal records. I would just like to do kind of a equity plug in there. When we're talking about criminal records, it's important that you're looking at not just minor offenses like something doing with driving or drugs when they're teenagers and things like that, but things that can cause specific harm towards youth. That's important. So when we're looking at those statistics, it's important to come back to what we're responsible for. We are responsible for keeping perpetrators from beginning or becoming mentors, which will prevent our youth from being harmed. It is not our job to prove or investigate. It's just to prevent them from entering the program. So, if you have a bad feeling, if you're interviewing them and you're like, something's not adding up, and it's more than just your implicit bias and things like that, you don't have to prove it. You don't have to go around proving like, oh, I fact checked and I did all this and I'm playing the investigator. It's okay for you to say, I just don't think they're going to be a great fit. If applicant has numerous items of concern in the process or staff has elevated a sense of unease, you may want to contact the local law enforcement. And we'll discuss later what some of those things are, what's appropriate. And so we don't want you just calling the police, willy-nilly, but if there's some things that really don't line up, it's okay to do so. And you don't have to play the police officer and put yourself in potential harm's way as well. So here are different challenges that impacts why why some of our programs don't have the best screening processes in place. If you look to the far left, there's in the yellow box, it says denial. 90% are unreported incidents. Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes there's pressure to conceal because if one bad report gets out, it might stigmatize all mentors, and then the adults won't trust us and want their youth to come, and it could potentially ruin our mentoring programs, right? Here are some of the things that keep our mouth shut. Sometimes we have no mandated standards. That's something else that Mentor Nebraska is here to help with. Is the standards, the national standards. They help to keep you safe as well. Sometimes processes are inconsistent across the agency. Sometimes a patchwork of state and federal statutes. Errors in database. Clearance may not indicate safety. And sometimes it's low priority in law enforcement. So all of these different things, some of them we can control. Sometimes they're internal processes, and some of them are external that impact and influence why we might not have the best screening practices. But our hope is that when you walk away, you know why it's important and have practical steps to put those processes in place. It's all about balance. Balance is crucial. And so match numbers, safety, save mentors, explain rewards, explain risk, cautious attitude, but open attitude, thorough process, but timely completion. Like all of these things require balance. And that's why we're also here. We understand that some of your mentoring programs do have limited staff. And so we do have no cost consultation available that you can apply for, where we can have a consultant come in, an expert consultant come in and help you think through some of these things. And these are just some ways that you can maintain this balance, so it's not all on you. Research a region, forge partnerships with local leaders in this field. Dedicate time biweekly to read and collect local stories about child sexual abuse and prevention efforts. Don't pretend to be an expert on everything. You don't have to be. And if you travel, look at specific stories and resources for that area. So these are just different things that you can do to grow in your understanding. We're going to shift gears and go to part 2. Child molestation, understanding perpetrators, victims, and dynamics of abuse. So when it comes to understanding victims and perpetrators of child molestation and dynamics of abuse, there are significant ethical issues involved with conducting research, and programs could potentially violate applicants' confidentiality. Therefore, we must borrow from related allied fields like psychology, social work, education, and youth development for us to develop our own systems as well. And these things that you're seeing are based on the prevalence of male perpetrators who sexually abuse boys, as these are the majority of child molesters. Is that surprising? Because a lot of times we think most of them are girls, but research does not show us that. So let's educate ourselves a little bit here about the different terms, because sometimes they're used interchangeably and that can bring confusion, okay? So let's look at child abuse. Child abuse is any act or failure to act which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse, or exploitation. That's what the definition of child abuse is. Child sexual abuse is sexual activities involving child intended for sexual stimulation. Abused activities are carried out using secrecy, force, or trickery. And we're going to talk later about a term called grooming, because that has to do a lot with it. Child molester. See, child molester, child predator, pedophile, and sex offender, these 4 words right here, if you look at how they're used in our society, they're very interchangeable. People use them in place of each other. And so we thought it was important to kind of distinguish the difference. So a child molester is any adult or ding, 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 child. It can be an adult or a child, male or female, known or unknown, who is at least 5 years older than the child he or she has sexually abused. That means it could be a 10-year-old. A 10-year-old could be a child molester if they're molesting a 5-year-old. So I think that's important to understand. It's not just limited to adults. A child predator is any adult whose primarily sexual interests lie with children. So persons under 18 years of age. A pedophile is a term used by psychologists for classification of treatment purposes. The absence of any key criteria could eliminate diagnoses. and then a sex offender used within the legal. So a pedophile is a psychological, like a psychologist terminology, whereas the sex offender is a law term. And it refers to those who offend against child of victims, adult victims, or both. So if we talk about like a fixated perpetrator, here are some of their characteristics. Their primary sexual orientation is to children. Pedophilic interests begin at adolescence, so it might be things that you saw when they were younger. Compulsive behavior, male victims are primary targets, little or no sexual contact with peers. Offender is usually single. These are just some of the attributes and characteristics. So if you're looking at female perpetrators, now I shared with you that the research shows that a lot of sexual offenders and even pedophiles are male. There are female perpetrators. An estimate of 1 to 10% of them are female. Abusers are female. Boys are more likely to be victims than girls with female perpetrators. So do you see that boys are actually even more at risk than what our society even showcases? May involve a male coercer or co-offender, teacher, or a lover. Often co-occurring mental health disorder, antisocial personality disorder, use alcohol or drugs, often were sexually abused as children themselves, often have non-violent prior offenses. They utilize a lot of persuasion, manipulation, violating trust, threats, and or force, more common with male abusers. And then when they are reported, even less actions typically taken because of society's stigmas. I mean, have you ever heard like a boy share, oh, they were sexually active at a very young age and it was with an older woman? And it's kind of like, oh, kudos to you. You had an older woman. Sometimes the older woman's 20, they were 14. Like, that's disturbing. So that's why I was saying there's so many different like stigmas and things that our society places on the shoulders of boys that sometimes boys aren't even able to process until they're older that harm was actually caused because of those things. So, but it happens more than we'd realize. Here are just some other general characteristics of perpetrators. Now let's kind of look at who's typically targeted. So, vulnerable, youth that are less credible. So maybe youth who have lied or youth who've been system involved with the juvenile justice system who've made mistakes. That's why they quote unquote look for troubled youth sometimes, because they know that sometimes people don't trust the youth. Youth that might be curious about sex, youth that want to please, people pleasers, youth that need attention or affection. Some youth that are taught to obey adults no matter what, may want to protect offender because of the grooming that we're going to talk about later. Victimization rates are constant from 2 years old and up. So they started at a very, very young age. The peak vulnerability ages are 7 through 13. And a lot of times that's who we're serving in our mentoring programs, right? And onset occurs prior to age 17 in most cases. So as you can see, a lot of these characteristics, they explain who. A lot of the youth that we're serving and wanting to support and uplift. And so that's why this training and having these screening processes are so important, because our youth are significantly at risk. So what does this tell you about the potential for sexual victimization within your youth clients? What we just said, they're at a peak. So I want us to be able to check out this video. Dr. Van Dam is the author of The Socially Skilled Child Molester, and she's going to share with us a little bit about what grooming entails. So give me one quick second. I'm going to make sure that we can hear the video.
Dr. Von Dam, how does a pedophile groom an organization or a community?
Well, actually, they all use the same strategies, and that's basically what motivated me to write the book, Identifying Child Molesters, because they do it at different levels of society. So some of them operate on low-income folks and hit on people in the bars. Some people are very successful and hit on high-income folks. So if you look at Sandusky or if you look at Seville, those are people who are very successful and they're operating at a high level. And basically, they ingratiate themselves by being too good to be true. They are always involved in all sorts of good works, always around kids, make themselves invaluable, and basically people just think that they're saints, and that is one of the ways that they make themselves above reproach, and people ignore any of the kinds of boundary violations that in other circumstances might have them be a little nervous or look askance or not be comfortable. And when they are uncomfortable about anything, they really find it hard to know what to do. And if they try to do anything, then they basically get put down for it. They are frightened. They're told to be quiet. They're intimidated. So there's a similar pattern. Exactly what happened and transpired in the case at Penn State happens again and again and again. And that was what was picked up on in the story that Malcolm Gladwell wrote when he referred to the case that I did in 1982 that was in the book on Mr. Clay. But it's the same story again and again and again. It hasn't changed. And so what we need to do is we need to figure out how we can change so that we don't put up with that anymore, so that we successfully make the world less safe for sex offenders. And there is a way to do that.
So were any of you surprised by that? I always find it interesting how she stated that they will do anything possible to make themselves above reproach. So you never, and this is going to be controversial what I'm about to bring up, but I'm going to do it anyways. Have any of you heard of the documentary called Surviving Neverland? Surviving Neverland, which is what Michael Jackson's mansion was called. Man, it was interesting. It had two men who had just come forward saying that they were actually molested by Michael Jackson as boys. And they really showcased the power of grooming. And Michael Jackson, they accused him, of course, now he's not alive to be able to defend himself, but they accused him of grooming not just them, but their families and the world. Michael Jackson presented himself to be childlike. Oh, Michael could never do that. He had such a traumatic upbringing, even though none of his other brothers operated like them and they had the same father. He had such a terrible upbringing. He wasn't able to be a child that's why he was childlike. Therefore, he was not capable of harming another child because he was a child himself. But like we know, a child molester, even if that were true, a child molester can still be a child to another child. But he was not. He was an adult playing with 14 and 12-year-old boys, and he's in his 20s and 30s. So he groomed oneself. He groomed people into believing things about him. We put strong focus on grooming because offenders often begin abusing a child. They don't often abuse a child right away. They build trust. They control, they play a game, they make it fun. They will see that child's vulnerable places that we talked a little bit about, and they'll capitalize on that and they'll meet that need and they'll want to become their friends. They'll build relationships with the parents. There's another documentary on Netflix called Abducted in Plain Sight. And it's about this man who literally groomed an entire family to get to their child. He had relationships with the mother. He had relationships with the father. He kept them separate so they didn't even know this was happening while he was having relationships with their daughter. And he had abducted her twice. So it's a whole process. So like I said, when it comes to grooming the child, it develops a relationship to win trust, become indispensable. So they make them dependent on them, codependent. They isolate the child and then they approach them for sexual contact eventually. It may involve threats, bribes, trickery, and the child may even receive pleasure or other benefits from the perpetrator. And that's where it gets really confusing because pleasure is supposed to be a good thing, right? And that's where it confuses some youth from coming forward because it's like, well, my body had a reaction when they did that. So maybe I did want it. Maybe I did ask for it. I didn't say no to this. I didn't say no to that. But when you're being groomed, it's all about manipulation, gaslighting, confusion. And that's why it ends up keeping many people silent is because of that. And then I shared a little bit about the community, family, and then agency grooming process. So by us, like Dr. Van had said, they work really hard at making themselves above reproach. And so sometimes we'll have a gut feeling and we'll even discount what we've seen or what we've heard or what we felt because no, he'd never do that. And then excuse me, sometimes they've done it so well that the parents may not want to end the relationship even after the abuse is revealed. It's some deep stuff, y'all. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to watch this conversation by a group of sexual predators and molesters that Oprah Winfrey actually had gotten to know. It's an entire series. We're only going to watch about 5 minutes of it. But it's going to give you insight directly in the minds and the process that they take their youth. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and I'm going to pull up the video. Okay. Sorry, y'all. I'm having a bit of difficult con. All right, we should be good to go now.
And so let's talk about the grooming process because I think I was 42 years old before I recognized that I'd been groomed. So I think if we can save one person out there who has been molested and is still blaming themselves or who doesn't understand that you guys are pretty conniving, manipulative, and actually smart in your seduction abilities. So how were you able to seduce? How did it start?
Basically, trust. You get them to trust you, and as time goes on, they trust you more.
And then before I often say this to parents that, and I've said it to even my friends with children, that a good molester isn't going to go full out rape the first time. A good molester is going to take his time and is going to work it. So I'm wondering if you shared with us that you started out by playing doctor, moving from doctor, getting more aggressive. Do you see how far you can go and then go farther?
With my victim, no. Okay, I was satisfied with what I was doing.
But did you start fondling and touching her immediately, Lee?
Pardon?
With this little 5-year-old girl, and you're 65 at the
Yeah,
time.
that's it.
Did you start touching her immediately? Or you first of all, you got to gain trust. You've got to woo them in. You've got to sort of lure them in, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And then do you decide I'm going to touch her knee and see how she reacts to that? Or I'm going to, you don't go full out genital
No,
throttle
I
at
was
first.
I was already touching her body in a medicine way.
Right.
Okay, and that led me to want to do more.
Were you sitting her on your lap? Were you playing with her on your lap? Were you doing?
That was even before any of the molest took place. It's just childish things that you do with your grandchildren or your, the molest came later, and then once it started, I was weak.
Is 5 the youngest you've molested?
Yes,
What's the oldest you've molested?
probably 10. That's when I was between 10 and 12.
10 and 12. So the grooming process, Darren.
Back rubs, foot rubs, it's anything that kind of initiates a physical touch. It doesn't have to be dirty at first. Like I said, it's grooming. It's something you lead up to, and it kind of creates a bond and whatever.
Getting them used to your hands being on them
Exactly.
and them trusting that. So that by the time you reach for a breast or you reach for the genital or whatever,
buttocks or whatever. Yeah.
it's easier. You're shaking your head because
that's very much how I initiated my grooming process. Is I would listen to her, and then I would listen to her with my hand on on her shoulder, and then we would cuddle on the couch together, and then priming her for me to be physically intimate with her.
very much like a couple on a first or second date, is it not? Where the guy reaches for your hand to see if that's going to be okay, and then he
Fake
reaches.
yawn.
Then you what
The
Robert?
fake yawn.
The fake yawn and the hand
Arm
around,
stretch out.
arm stretched out, and let's talk about your grooming process.
Mine's kind of different from everybody else. With me, I'd start
Because you raped each of your victims after a short time.
I'd tell them nice things about themselves. Tell them what they wanted to hear. It just was real nice to them. And like with the second victim, I got in real close with her parents because I knew her stepdad. And so it was real easy to get in with her parents to trust me in order to get into the house. So
Were you doing that on purpose?
not
Were
intentionally.
you getting in with her parents so that you could get close to her?
Not intentionally, but yeah.
What do you mean not
Yeah,
intentionally?
what does
I
that
wasn't-
mean?
I didn't realize it at the time that I was, but now that I look back on it, I was doing it intentionally.
Getting in with the parents.
Right.
What would your behavior be? Because, somebody asked me as I was on the way here about how I could sit with you guys and not be in judgment and not be, like, you're going to go talk to those despicable guys. I go, well, if I'm going to sit in judgment of you guys, then I got to be in judgment of over half the world. Because the truth is, all of us know somebody who's doing this, whether you know or not. And I'm wondering whether or not you feel a distinction between yourselves and the people that we, read about in the paper who rape children, maim children, kill children. Do you see a difference between yourself and those people?
I do. I mean, I read those things in the paper, and I'm thinking, how could you do this? How could you hurt a child? How could you cut off their arms and legs? I forget the case, but how can you do this to a child? How can you do it to anybody? I mean, I am not a hurtful person, and yeah,
So do you think there are different levels of offenders?
I think there is.
Do you?
Yeah, I think, some offenders are murderers,
Yes.
and I don't think I have the capability of being a murderer myself.
So, was that interesting for any of you, that case study where you're listening to the different offenders? Just to give you some perspective, the man on the far left, the older man, was a doctor. And while he was in practice, he was molesting his patients. The man on the right of him, who had the kind of swollen eyes, he was molesting his daughter. The man to the right of him was molesting. He was a child molester, and he was a child himself. He was more than 5 years older than who he was molesting, and it lasted from adolescence clear through them becoming adults before his victim realized that she was being molested by him, because he had been doing it since they were kids. And then the man on the far right, who had raped each of his victims, he would do that with teenage girls, even while being married. So that gives you a little bit of context of who was in the room. But was that interesting, kind of hearing directly from the mouths of those who have been perpetrators and molesters? So I want you to think, like I said, were you surprised? Question 2, how might you spot this behavior in your matches? They talked about trust. They talked about being a good molester. It takes time. That's what Oprah talked about. It doesn't happen overnight. So could you see how that could impact our mentor relationships? How it can impact our monitoring and supporting. So sometimes when we talk about our processes, we talk primarily about the onboarding process, but monitoring and supporting the match, meaning after they've been matched, still checking in, still having times where you see them interact, talking with parents and youth and the mentor, still gives you access, to keeping the youth safe, because they're not typically in harm's way as much at the beginning of the match as they are after time has taken place, trust has been built. So having those processes is vital. We only have 2 more sections left, y'all. Thank you so much for being so patient and navigating this content with me. We're going to be wrapping up here soon. We've already been meeting a little over an hour. Can you believe it? So part 3, red flags and informed intuition. Remember how I was talking about, like, did you have a gut feeling? Think about Edwin. Remember how we started and we went through the profile with Edwin? Think about that. Were there any red flags? What's a red flag? It's woohoo, something might not be right. That's a red flag, right? So there's going to be 10 red flags that we go through that you should be aware of when you're going through your screening process. All right. So red flags. The ideal candidate could be really awesome, but they might have a lack of balance in their life. It could be they are part of tons of youth programs, and you're like, well, but you have kids at home. Like, how are you this involved in the community, but you have kids at home, or you have a wife at home, or other things are not being tended to. They may have some extreme behaviors. So they acts inside of the range of expected norm behavior at a different stage of the screening process. So be wary of a mentor candidate whose behavior is extremes in terms of being like overly eager and cooperative, or being impatient about the screening process. So are they calling you a lot? Hey, what's going on? What's the holdup? Like, that is a red flag, right? If they have extreme behaviors. Inappropriate behavior is that third. So an ideal candidate is someone who's comfortable with, not conflicted by, and does not possess any hidden motives for their involvement with the organization. So examples of inappropriate behavior could be someone who is vague about how they heard about the program. I'm not sure. I just heard of you before. Who is concerned with collecting agency PR material before even getting involved. Can I have materials of who you're working with, like pictures or whatever? Who doesn't relate to staff in a socially appropriate way. Remember I mentioned Michael Jackson, how he had a hard time relating with adults. So if you see someone who, over involvement with children, who is more focused on like talking with the kids or playing with the kids. And don't get me wrong, we want them to engage, we want them to be able to relate and talk, but if it's kind of like childlike and they're not really talking to you and they're really awkward with you, but when you see them with kids are completely different, that could be a red flag. And then find the fifth one on this page is under involvement with adults. So just as what I said, if they barely talk to you. Another one, unhealthy attitudes. So when I think of unhealthy attitudes, it could be they may have strong views on like children's rights, like children should have the same rights as adults have, and that's just an example. Like, what are their perspectives on child and children and adult relationships and things like that? Problematic background indicators. So the ideal candidate would have no background indicators that have been identified as highly correlated to child predator activity. So when we think about like those characteristics that we discussed earlier, maybe they have one on the list, but if they have tons, that could just make them a higher risk. So some examples, and again, this is not for you to create a checklist like, oh, they're checking on the box. All of us are not defined by our childhoods. None of us are defined by even our traumas, but it's just something for you to be mindful of. So we're not asking you to take this and run with it and have checklists and think everyone that does have a similar background is going to turn into a perpetrator. But when we just look at the data and what research shows us, they do have some of these traumas. So a history of being abused, neglected, or sexually victimized themselves. A police record, even if it's seemingly unrelated to crimes against children. History of alcohol, other substance abuse. A military history, especially if they're discharged. A history of moving from job to job or place to place. Being overly involved in youth center extracurricular activities. A history of depression, so on and so forth. They're just potential indicators. Again, I really want to land there. This does not mean that if they have some of these, that they are. Are they trying to control the process? Like, are they micromanaging you? Are they really like impatient about the process or calling and checking up? Did you call my references? What did they say? Excuse me. So on and so forth. Like, that's not typical behavior. Problematic personal interest and focus on their personal needs over the needs of the youth. So this could be like, oh, I like to take pictures. And you're like, well, did you get permission? If you like check their social media and all their pictures involve their youth, that could be a red flag. So these are just some things to be mindful of. And this is just like I said, one red flag does not equal you have a perpetrator. You want to have informed intuition. And so let's talk about what that is. So informed intuition, here's a quote about it. So Detective Stephen, which was a part of the SJPD Child Exploitation Unit, he did he would interview with all types of people around child molestation cases and so on and so forth. And here is one of the quotes that he gained from it. So a woman said, he said, I have investigated hundreds of child predator cases involving thousands of victims. In the case of every single victim, there was a woman, a mother, an agency staff or teacher who looked back and said, I thought something wasn't right. I had a funny feeling about him. Right? He's like, in every single one, there was like at least one person who said something didn't feel right. And that, my friends, is what informed intuition is. It's you being able to make a judgment that appears quickly in consciousness. Now, like I said, sometimes implicit bias and prejudices and stereotypes can impact and influence that. Don't get me wrong. But there's been some things that just don't seem right that we'll just tuck off and put it in the back of our minds. And I'm going to give you an example. A couple of years ago, I think it was 3 years ago, there was an elementary first grade teacher, male first grade teacher, that ended up getting tons of charges against him concerning sexual assault and misconduct with children, his students. And it was who ended up turning him in were his peers, his teaching peers. They didn't feel right. They would see him maybe walk in randomly and a student was on his lap, or they just saw things that just didn't seem right. And they ended up having to turn him into the police because they had gone to the principal, and the principal, that above reproach, remember, didn't take it seriously. And when they did further investigating, they found out that even the education background check missed out on somewhere else he had lived before in a Catholic school. It wasn't private school. So, I mean, it was a private school, so it wasn't as in the open in the background check that he ended up getting released because of something that happened in the Catholic school. And so that's just an example, but it was that informed intuition of, luckily in that case, many that led to it. So it's you making a judgment that appears quickly in consciousness. You might not be fully aware of the underlying reasons, but strong enough to act upon it, knowing without knowing. So it's that funny feeling. And then finally, we're in our last section, y'all. So let's talk about some recommended tools and processes for screening and monitoring. So programs have the legal right to accept, reject, or terminate volunteers. And guess what? You don't have to give them a reason. You can just say, hey, unfortunately, we think this might not be the best fit. So breathe, right? It's not like you've got to go toe to toe with this potential perpetrator that you think you're talking to. You can just, I don't think you're going to be the best fit. There's no limitations on what information you can ask the volunteers. So I want you to think about that. Like, if there's questions that you think are important to ask them, they may say, I'm not comfortable answering that. They may ask you, why is that appropriate? Why do you think that's appropriate? But you can ask it. So, but you need to be equitable in your processes. That third point says every candidate must go through the same process. So let's look at these different ways and strategies you can have in place for screening. So we're going to talk about, so we're going to go through these quickly. So upfront education. I think it's important for you to discuss with your mentors, your staff and everything about the upfront education, being thorough with them about what the process will entail, right? You know, some of the things that we had talked about, red flags, were, are they trying to micromanage your process? If you're upfront and you share with them, hey, this may take some time, and this is what we're looking for. We need references. This is what our process entails. That can help in many ways. You want to have a written application, face-to-face interview. Something else that I would like to say that's really important is that you do not have only one person going through each of these steps. It's really important, as I shared, like with those teachers, there were multiple teachers that had their hands in the process. So they're able to all collectively see different things. And when they came together to talk about the teacher, they all were able to inform, we don't think something's right. So that is really important when we're talking about implicit bias and some of the things that we carry. If you have more than one person interacting with the process, then you all can collectively say, hey, I felt really good, and talk together, or say something didn't, rub me the right way. This is what happened. What are your thoughts about it? You can kind of have a balanced approach together. So I think that's important to note as well. Reference checks are really important. What type of references? You shouldn't just ask them solely for professional references. Have a character reference, a professional reference, a family reference. Have references in place that will help you gain a holistic perspective on who the mentor is. Background checks. We talked about how more than 50% of those who were even doing background checks only did it in one state. It's important to have a perspective about where else they've lived and see if there's any patterns elsewhere. Home visits. This might be difficult, but it can give you some more insight on family life, right? The psychometric testing is something that's really expensive, but if you wanted to know more about it, just look that up, psychometric testing. It's a test where you're able to screen them through a series of questions, and it can help you determine based on the questions whether they're at high risk for being a potential predator. Internet searches, Google, and then training and monitoring and support. So how your training's placed and the monitoring and support, how you're checking in, calling and seeing how things are going, even as they've already been matched. Like I said, they're not most at risk. Our youth are not most at risk at the beginning of a match. They're most at risk as they've already maintained trust and had their relationship in place for a while. So basically, by you compiling data from all available screening tools, these things that we discussed, you're able to gain a holistic portrait of each applicant. That's what we're trying to get. We're not looking for perfection, right? That's not what we're here for. But we are trying to gain a whole perspective on who this person is, how they're going to impact our youth, and is our youth going to be safe? And ultimately, is our mentoring program going to be safe as well, so that you can continue to impact more youth? So throughout this entire cycle of a volunteer's contact with the agency, you should put some intentionality in the program design, preparing youth and parents. When we were talking about, let me go back really quickly, this upfront education. Volunteer recruitment strategies, application process, the post-match, all of these things can impact how safe they are. And so I wanted, if some of this is kind of like, okay, in our program design, we feel like we have strategies in place, but our preparing youth and parents need to be, strengthened. Our volunteer recruitment, how we're recruiting our volunteers. Our application process maybe can be strengthened so that we can have some questions in place to really gain a bigger picture of who this person is. And our monitoring and support, that post-match process definitely needs to be strengthened. And so, as I mentioned, as we were talking earlier, we do have something called no-cost consultations. We have 7 consultants on our team that are able to come and help you fine-tune this and strengthen your approaches so you're not having to do it alone. So if that's something that you are interested in, feel free to shoot me an email or go to mentornebraska.com, and there's a way you can apply. So now I want you to think about back on Edwin. I'm not going to read it again, but based on what information you've gained, would you choose him again? Think about how he found them. Think about what he was involved with. Think about Glenda, his wife, and the boys and their behaviors and how they were acting and in his background. Would you choose him still? Think about one of your most worst case scenarios that you've already encountered in your position. Could you look back and defend your process that you had in place that led to you letting them go or ignoring your informed intuition and bringing them in? Moving forward, for you to strengthen your processes and become even more informed, it's important for you to realize we don't expect you to be an expert. Use the people around you and the experts around you to help you, just as like our consultants, shameless plug there. Maintain strong monitoring and support systems. Project Harmony has excellent resources that you could reach out to them. They're a nonprofit here in Omaha that have tons of trainings and resources. In Darkness to Light is another training. So those are just some of the things that you can equip yourself with to strengthen your processes. And thanks for spending the time with us today. And let us know if we can support you in any way. Have a great day, everyone.